The day after the US Grand Prix, the first Soviet soldiers began leaving Hungary, aiming to complete their withdrawal from the country by the 1st of June. A couple of weeks later, on the day of the Brazilian race, Hungary held its first free parliamentary election since 1948, with the centre-right MDF, Hungarian Democratic Forum, under Josef Antal, taking most of the seats, beating into second place the more liberal Alliance of Free Democrats, who had been the primary opposition to communist rule until then. Without having an outright majority, Antal entered a coalition with two smaller parties, the third-placed Independent Smallholders Party and the sixth-placed Christian Democratic People's Party, with the former Communist, now Socialist Party coming fourth, and going into opposition along with the Alliance of Free Democrats and the centre-left Federation of Young Democrats, known as Fidesz. The USSR amended its constitution too. Among other reforms, the new arrangement created the post of President of the Soviet Union, creating a stronger, more US-style executive presidency rather than simply being the General Secretary of the Communist Party. The Congress of People's Deputies chose Mikhail Gorbachev as the first president of the USSR for a 5-year term, with open elections for the post planned for 1995. A few days after that, East Germany held its first free elections, with the Alliance for Germany ending up as the largest party, but without an overall majority. The alliance was a coalition of three centre-right parties headed by the Christian Democrats, who had recently reconnected with their West German counterparts after decades as a satellite party of the Communists, and the alliance ran on a platform of quick reunification of the country. In a rather distant second place was the centre-left Social Democrat Party, who were initially reluctant to form a government with the alliance because it included the right-wing populist German Social Union, but in the end a deal was agreed, and the alliance and SPD formed a new East German government headed by Lothar de Maizière. Tensions between Hungarian and Romanian ethnic groups in Transylvania had not been dissipated by the Romanian Revolution in late 1989, and more fighting was sparked on the 15th of March when members of the Romanian community took exception to Hungarian speakers celebrating Hungary's National Day in the city of Târgu Mureș, or Marosvásárhely to Hungarians, which had an almost 50-50 ethnic mix. 5 people died and 300 were injured in the ensuing violence. Outside of the ongoing collapse of communist rule in Eastern Europe, a diplomatic storm blew up between the UK and Iraq, when the latter hanged Iranian-born British-based journalist Farzad Barzoft as a spy. He had heard rumours about an explosion at a military complex, possibly related to the Saddam government's attempt to acquire ballistic missile technology, and headed to the area to try and find out more. He'd been arrested back in September and appeared on Iraqi TV in November, having been made to confess to being an Israeli agent, but despite appeals for clemency and protests from the British government, he was given a quick one-day trial, not allowed to appeal, and executed a few days later. Apparently in order to get it done before Ramadan began, according to documents captured in 2003. The British ambassador to Iraq was withdrawn, though in private many of the ruling Conservative Party actually supported Iraq's actions. Namibia became independent from South Africa. The former colony of German Southwest Africa had been allocated to South Africa to administrate following World War I, but during the Cold War had become a flashpoint for proxy campaigns as the USSR and Cuba, as well as neighbouring communist Angola, provided financial aid and military support for the independence movement, while South African counterinsurgency operations had spilled over into Angola and Zambia. A ceasefire had finally been agreed in 1988, with UN peacekeepers deployed and elections in November 1989, with SWAPO, the aforementioned independence movement, elected as the new government with a 97% turnout. SWAPO leader Sam Nujoma was declared President of Namibia, a constitution was adopted on February 1990, and on the 21st of March, recently released Nelson Mandela was among the hundreds of dignitaries from around the world present in Windhoek to watch the new nation's flag being raised. And Brazil had held its first free presidential election since 1961. Now in March, the same day as Gorbachev was elected president of the USSR and Farzad Barzoft was hanged, Fernando Collor de Mello took office and immediately introduced a series of dramatic economic reforms to try and stabilise the country's galloping hyperinflation. A new currency was introduced, the Cruzeiro, replacing the Cruzado Novo, 80% of private savings and assets were frozen for 18 months. Wages and prices were frozen. Several government agencies were abolished with 300,000 employees fired, financial transactions heavily taxed, banks closed, credit cards not accepted. Nobody quite knew exactly what was going to happen, but it seemed likely that things would be very tough on ordinary Brazilians in the short term. It was 9 days after that the Formula One teams arrived for the second Grand Prix of the year, and for 1990 the Brazilian Grand Prix had moved from the Jacarepaguá circuit in Rio de Janeiro to Sao Paolo, and the Interlagos circuit that had been used between 1972 and 1980. The circuit had been heavily redesigned and nearly halved in length. The new track had lost 3 long straights and 9 fast curves, which had been regarded as too dangerous, with the increasing speeds of cars in the ground effect era. The new layout had 2 long straights and a twisty infield section, and still had some of the problems with the bumpy surface that had bedevilled the old track, but was regarded as much safer. One unusual feature that drew some criticism, though, was that the pit lane exit was right on the racing line at the end of the first chicane, which seemed like a recipe for emerging cars to be rear-ended. The Jacarepaguá circuit itself had never been hugely popular, being somewhat flat and featureless, but at the same time the glitz and glamour of the F1 circus seemed to fit in much better at the beaches of Rio than the smog-covered industrial sprawl of Sao Paolo, whose favelas were very visible from the racetrack. Not everyone was convinced, but it was certainly seen as a sign of the times that we were moving from the hometown of Nelson Piquet to that of Ayrton Senna. The only slight fly in the ointment was that, while the Rio circuit had been renamed after Nelson Piquet a few years earlier, the Interlagos circuit had been renamed the Autodromo José Carlos Pace in 1985, after the famous Brazilian driver who'd lost his life in an air crash in 1977, so they couldn't very well rename it the Autodromo Ayrton Senna so soon afterwards. Instead, the tricky downhill chicane off the start-finish straight was named the Ayrton Senna, which would have to do. The only change to the entry from Phoenix was that Alex Caffey had recovered from falling off his bike and was back in the Arrows, although still a bit sore, while Gianni Morbidelli continued to deputise for Pirro at Scuderia Italia. There was a bit of a flap at the airport when, thanks to the rapidly changing rules on import taxes, nobody was quite sure how much to charge the Goodyear consignment, and the tyres ended up being held for a couple of days before higher authorities intervened, presumably to ask airport security if they really wanted to be the ones to stop Ayrton Senna racing. And so the pre-qualifiers went out to have the first go on the new circuit, and it was the Lolas taking the top 2 positions, with Suzuki pipping Guiar into second by just 5 thousandths, Dalmas taking the final slot just 3 hundredths behind the Azella. Roberto Moreno's Eurobrunn suffered an ignition failure just 200 metres out of the pit lane, and the team let him borrow Claudio Lange's car to put in 2 fast laps, and promising Claudio he'd get the car back by the end of the session. Unfortunately, the team then miscalculated the fuel, and Roberto ran out on his second lap, meaning poor Claudio, who'd only put in a single exploratory lap, was once again miles off the pace. He was even behind Bertrand Gachot, who was still having all sorts of problems in a Coloni, which had quickly acquired the nickname of the White Whale. But at least Bert was able to get a lap or 2 in, even if he was 10 full seconds off the pace. Gary Brabham was beginning to realise just what a shambles life racing were turning out to be, having shown up uncertain if they'd even make it to Brazil. His Life W12 threw a Conrod on his outlap, and that was the limit of his participation. 1 Brazilian down, 3 still in the running as qualification proper got underway, with the grandstands packed despite the financial situation as the locals came to see their idol Ayrton Senna take pole position, which he duly did in dominant fashion. The first 3 rows were sorted by team, in fact, with Berger lining up alongside Senna, followed by Boutsen and Patrese, then Mansell and Prost only managing 5th and 6th after some problems with their qualifying tyres. Alesi was best of the rest after his Phoenix heroics in 7th, followed by fellow Phoenix hotshots Martini and De Cesaris, then Alio in the Ligier and Bernard in the Lola. The Benettons also struggled, with Piquet, the only man in the field to have driven the old circuit, 13th, and Nannini 15th. And both looking forward to the new car arriving at the next race. Martin Donnelly split the 2 Benettons in his Lotus, which was turning out to be fast in a straight line but completely hopeless in corners, with Gianni Morbidelli making his race debut in 16th. The Japanese pair were 18th and 19th, Caffey made his Arrows debut from 25th, and Dalmas squeaked onto the grid to make his first Grand Prix start since the second race of 1989, which was at Imola. Onyx, still undergoing management changes and suffering from problems with grip, engine, suspension and transmission, both failed to qualify, but even they went quicker than the Leighton House pairing, who just couldn't get the cars to work at all. Last year's third-placed finisher Gugelmin was slowest of all. No excuses, said team manager Ian Phillips, and promised that they'd be offered him while doing some extensive testing over the next few weeks. The new track caught a few drivers out, but the response was generally positive, with the bumps the only real complaint. Sunday dawned overcast and windy, with thunder showers forecast for later in the afternoon, but hopefully missing race time. As the stands filled up on Sunday, official attendance 100,000, the expectation was massive. Senna's pole was his 43rd in 96 races, and this would be his 6th Brazilian Grand Prix, his 5th in competitive equipment, but he'd still never won on home tarmac. Surely, the script said, 1990, in front of his hometown crowd, 4 days after his 30th birthday, would be the charm. Jean-Marie Balestre took his life in his hands by attending the race himself, minders in tow, which the crowd responded to with some pretty graphic banners expressing their opinion of him, his parentage, and so on. New Brazilian President Fernando Collor de Mello was also there, and also unpopular, but the crowd were quickly distracted as the lights went green and off they went, with Senna storming into the lead while Berger got in Boutsen's way and Patrese got away slowly, which led to a contact between Alesi and De Cesaris as they tried to squeeze round him, sending the unfortunate Andrea off into the sandpit. Nannini was also collateral damage, having to come in to have his nose cone replaced, and Gianni Morbidelli had an off-camera spin caused by a sticking throttle. Not a good day for Scuderia Italia so far, but he kept it moving at least. So Senna led round with Berger right on his tail, followed by Boutsen and the Ferraris of Prost and Mansell, with Patrese in 6th and Alesi 7th. For the first few laps the top 6 didn't change, but Berger gradually dropped off Senna and started to come under attack by Boutsen. On lap 8 the Belgian got a tow down the straight and slingshotted past the Austrian and set off in pursuit of Senna. On the same lap Guillard tangled with Alboretto's arrows and came off second best. Berger seemed to be having some minor problems in his car as he was now reeled in by Prost, who came through on lap 17, by which time Senna's lead over Boutsen was just over 3 seconds. Further back there was a cracking battle for 9th between the other Brazilian in the race, Nelson Piquet, and Stefano Modena in the Brabham, who'd taken the place until Piquet bullied his way back past. Prost was soon up with Boutsen, while Mansell was also on a charge, but Berger, his car apparently now working better, was also now back up with Prost as the Professor made his way through traffic. Mansell's charge faltered and he came into the pits on lap 27 to have his car looked at. 4 tyres changed and then his steering wheel was removed and poked at, then put back on again and off he went. Gearbox problems? Nobody seemed entirely sure, but whatever it was they hadn't fixed it and he went boiling back out of the pits in 9th. A few laps later it was Boutsen's turn to pit, but his brakes were already fading and nearly went entirely as he entered his box, still doing some 60 miles an hour, and hit 1 waiting tyre and 2 mechanics, one of whom went tumbling over his side pod. He rolled forwards into the box, visibly shaken, to have 4 wheels and now his nose cone replaced. He returned to the track 11th and lapped, and would have to hope his brakes held out for the rest of the race. Prost stopped too, while the Brazilian TV cameras decided to watch Gianni Morbidelli for a bit, while they tried to organise replays of the Boutsen pit incident. Senna made his own stop a little later as the race approached its halfway point, while on track the action was with Alesi and Piquet scrapping hard over 5th, some 20 seconds behind the top 4, and Piquet took the place on lap 33. 4th placed Patrese was the latest in a series of drivers to be caught out on the Senna S, but got moving again before Piquet and Alesi could come past. With Berger's stop a lap later, the order at half distance was Senna, Prost, Patrese, Berger, Piquet and Alesi. Nelson made an excellent stop and Patrese bumped in to have his gravel-studded tyres replaced and dropped back to 6th. And with that, the top 6 had spread out sufficiently that it looked unlikely there'd be much more racing done, as everyone settled in for the back straight and Senna led the way through the back markers. Next up was his old teammate Nakajima, who moved smartly out of the way, but in doing so put 2 wheels on the marbles and slid sideways into the McLaren, knocking its front wing off. Senna fumed in for a new nose, while Nakajima became public enemy number 1 in Brazil, which was a little harsh because he was absolutely mortified. Pundits observed that Senna had had no real need to go scything through just there, and had somewhat brought it on himself, but you couldn't really expect his fans to see it that way. all of which left Prost in the lead on lap 44 of the 71, with Berger second by just 4.5 seconds, Senna third and some 25 seconds behind his teammate, Patrese fourth, Mansell fifth and Alesi sixth. Boutsen made his way up past Alesi, somewhat calmed by the news that his pit lane accident had led to some scrapes and bruises, but nothing serious. Patrese's car started emitting oil smoke and he lost fourth to Mansell before dropping out entirely on lap 65, moving Boutsen and Alesi up. The Tyrrell driver was still fighting hard with Piquet over that last point. Alain Prost came home to take his 40th Grand Prix win and his first for Ferrari, and the team's 100th Grand Prix win, all of which made the sweeter by him doing so on Senna's own doorstep. Berger came in second, 13.5 seconds adrift, with cramp in his braking foot brought on by the cockpit tub just being a bit too small for his lanky frame, and the home hero trailed in a chastened and lonely third. Mansell came in fourth. It turned out he'd had a cracked roll bar, which was what was causing the handling problem he'd pitted about, with Boutsen fifth and Piquet nicking the last point and $100,000 from Alesi on the last lap. Nakajima put the other Tyrrell accreditable 8th from 19th on the grid, despite his embarrassment at taking his old friend out, and Nannini joined Patrese in being classified despite not actually finishing, in this case with a puncture. The last classified was Gianni Morbidelli, gallantly finishing his first race 7 laps adrift after losing 5 of them in the pits, having his sticky throttle fixed early on. Senna's 4 points for third were enough to keep him top of the table at least, with Alesi and Tyrrell respectively knocked off second spots by Prost and Ferrari. And now there was a huge gap of some 7 weeks before the next race at Imola on the 13th of May, where several teams were due to be introducing new cars, including Benetton, Tyrrell and Brabham, who would also need to find a new driver in the interim as Gregor Wojtek moved across to the Onyx team, now part owned by his father. The Leighton House and Lotus teams, meanwhile, would be spending the intervening time looking at the 1990 cars they were already using and wondering what on earth was wrong with them.